I'm Paul H. Smith. I've had the fortune and misfortune both of being the conference chair this year for this conference as well as for last year. Thanks, I appreciate that, but I have to say that a lot of the credit for how well this is run, I owe to the people that helped me and that did a huge amount of work to make this work. I'll recognize them at the end if I don't forget and then get in trouble with them. My other hats, beyond this, as I mentioned at the very beginning, I'm president of Remote Viewing Instructional Services, a company I started at the time I retired from the Army. We offer remote viewing training. We offer operational remote viewing. We're commercial, obviously, which is, we feel that it's we're part of the remote viewing community, but we are commercial as opposed to the nonprofit function of the organization that we're involved in here with this conference. I spent 7 years in what became known as the Stargate remote viewing program. I was recruited by the Army into that unit in September of 1983. I served until 1990, at which point I was transferred to the 101st Airborne for some time in the desert without showers. That's how I'll always remember that phase of my life, although there were some exciting moments. I don't know what else to tell you. That's probably enough of an introduction. As I launch into my talk, which you can see is Remote Viewing's Biggest Bugaboo, How We Come to Think We Know What Really Isn't So, I want to ask how many heard me talk about this on Jeff Rentz? Jeff Rentz asked me, what does that mean? Some of you heard. Those of you who raised your hands, I don't want you to answer this question. Who thinks they know what I'm talking about by this title? Any ideas? I want a hand. AOL, Analytic Overlay. Way back there. Is that Jeffrey? Displacement, okay. Whoa, we're going to have to get some explanation of that one. I won't ask you for that now, okay? But yeah, and it may actually apply. Specifically, we're talking about analytical overlay. I called it analytic overlay for years. I used that with Ingo one time when I was on the phone, Ingo Swan, and he said, huh, it's analytical overlay. He's kind of a stickler for words, so I said, yes, sir, and only slip every once in a while now. Analytic overlay, and we're going to find out what that is here in a minute, along with some other things. Now, this is my first time with PowerPoint. Never used PowerPoint before. A number of us that are in that same boat. Can't guarantee it'll go flawlessly, but we'll see. I also want to tell you that I'm going to be talking about some psychology stuff here. I am not a psychologist, and what I'm going to talk about is very preliminary and superficial, and I may make some mistakes, and I know there's some experts out there, so Michael O'Bannon, I don't want any sharpshooting, okay? But I think you'll find some interesting correlations between the effects and results of remote viewing and some interesting phenomena from the psychological domain. Okay, how we come to think we know what really isn't so. Now, if I can push the right button here, we're going to talk about mental noise. What it is, a little bit, what causes it, a little bit, and how to deal with it, a little bit. There are no ultimately fully, completely right answers here, but there are some general ideas that we can learn that may help us improve our remote viewing abilities. Where does mental noise come from? First is the environment. You might call this environmental overlay. If there's things going on while you're trying to remote view, acoustic sorts of interference, visual sorts of interference, a busy carpet, a picture of a sailboat on a wall, a garbage truck loading garbage in the background, any of those things can intrude on the data you produce. It's not remote viewing data, that is extraneous stuff, that is noise. Okay? I don't want to talk too much about that today. The obvious way to exclude that is to exclude as much environmental noise as you can. It got to the point, in fact, in this attempt at SRI, that they created an all-gray room. It's the kind of place you wouldn't want to be for half your life, that's for sure. But it did cut down on the noise. Acoustically shielded, everything painted the same shade of gray, a soft carpet, unpatterned, and it worked pretty well at excluding environmental noise. Personal, what we call inclemencies. These are issues that might get in the way, that might be nagging at you, might be bothering you mentally or emotionally as you set out to try and do a remote viewing session. They can be physical, you've got a headache, you're feeling sick to your stomach, something like that. It might be emotional, your dog was just run over, your wife has left you, your wife has come back. Things like that, Could be social, you're being snubbed at school, you can't get your AK-47 and go back, doggone it. So these kinds of things, eat at you, cause you problems, might bother you. You have to get rid of those. That's another form of mental noise that you can exclude by acknowledging that it's a problem. Writing it down helps. I think, so I recall in Skip's presentation, he talked about this little box you put your troubles in and put it away. You can use that kind of methodology, something like that. Something to get rid of the stuff that's bothering you so you don't have to think about it while you're trying to remote view. But one of the biggest issues we have is analytical. And we're going to talk about that in more detail. That is where the cognitive processes that normally occur in the human mind, and the content of those cognitive processes overlay, confuse, get in the way of the data that we're trying to extract from the target that we're addressing. Here are some examples showing you kind of processes that people go through and some of the ways that analysis intrudes. This is a target that Hella Hamid, looking to see how well it scanned. Oh, well, it'll do, I guess. And actually, originally a friend of Russell's, who he introduced to the program, a target that she worked in one of their experiments. The target was this civilian overpass with a cyclone fencing over the top of it to keep people from throwing bricks into passing cars. This being California, that you can understand why that's an issue. Okay. At any rate, Hella remote viewed this target, not knowing what it was. I presume, Russell, this was an outbounder probably?
This was Hella's very first trial.
Okay, good. Hella's very first trial, an outbounder. Somebody, perhaps Hal or Russell or somebody, went to the target, interacted with it. Hella described where the person was, not knowing what the target was, and she arrived at this description. She drew these crisscrossy lines that receded into the distance. She drew these arrows like this. She drew some things like, circular kinds of things going in a direction. She said it's like a trough up in the air, only there are holes in it so it couldn't hold water. Okay? You can see the analysis going. This reminded her of a trough. And yet more data came in and she said, but there's something not quite right. But she couldn't quite identify what it was. There are things going past really fast. What were those things? Cars. So you see an interesting thing here. She's got a little bit of information. She tries to draw conclusions, comes up with this trough idea, and there are things happening that she can't identify. She knows they're doing something. She describes what she knows of them, but what it all signifies, what it means, she hasn't really quite got a handle on. Another example. This was done by a CIA skeptic, one that they ultimately converted to the reality of remote viewing. I believe Hal was the outbounder on this, if I remember right. Went to this playground. A budding physicist and world-renowned figure jumping on a merry-go-round and going around and around. I kind of envision him doing that in a suit, but I don't think he probably was wearing one. So, the CIA skeptic, back in the isolation chamber. Were you monitoring this, Russell?
This was our third one with her, and she felt we were cueing her, so she wanted to do it entirely by herself.
Oh, this was a female. Ah.
We took away the phone and taped the door closed, but we didn't trust her either.
Okay, let me repeat this, Russell, for the record. This person was a skeptic, did not trust the SRI personnel. And so they took away the phone that was in there and taped the door closed because they didn't trust her either. She produced this result. If you'll note, the sketch is pretty interesting, isn't it? If you were going to match this, you'd probably have a very good chance of matching the target to the actual sketching. And I can't read this too clearly. I don't know if you can. Some sort of structure thing on top of something else. I can't read it. Rod in a general sense. Extended dome type lightning rod. They identify here something as lightning rod, okay? And top view, and then here a medium, I can't read that either. I'm gonna have to scan it in higher resolution next time, maybe darkness. Anyway, and I don't seem to see it on here, but it was called, the viewer called it a cupola, like on top of a building or something, okay? Well, we can see what it is. We can see it's a merry-go-round. We see that the sketch is pretty darn accurate, as, in the sort of way you might expect of what the actual target is. But the viewer has interpreted what this thing is, concluded that it's the top of a structure with a lightning rod on it, okay? Taken real data and turned it into something else. Here's another one. This is from one of my students. You'll find this interesting. These are the words. I've got up and down here twice. That's inadvertent. Up and down motion is associated with the target. A rolling across patterned metal sound. The idea of something rolling across some kind of patterned material or metal. Like rolling over a graded surface. Some portion of the structure is rounded or like a somewhat flattened dome shape. This seemed to rest atop a narrower surface. Height and visibility are accentuated. This, in a sense of motion, created a queasy response from the viewer. So you see some subjective reaction to this. A little bit of motion sickness, perhaps. Something like that. The viewer's feeling a little queasy caused by the motion and stuff associated with this. Speed of travel is associated with the site. The site serves a controlling function. There's a strong AOL of an air traffic control tower. What do you think it was? Somebody suggest a roller coaster? What else? Any other ideas? Okay. Speed of motion, up and down motion has to do with speed in some sense. There's a taller part on top of a narrower part. Controlling function, AOL of air traffic control. Are you ready? You see, some of that data is actually right, isn't it? Some of the data is actually right. Speed of motion is involved, but the interpretation was fast motion. But you notice the data didn't say it was fast or slow. There's a controlling function involved. The narrow and taller part is true, overlooking, overseeing, all that stuff. Like wheels rolling on graded metal, I have no idea what kind of subsurface or strata, whatever you call it, surface is rolling on. But the interpretation was air traffic control tower. You see analysis at work here, trying to interpret or come to a conclusion about the data that's presented. People have tried to figure this mental noise stuff out for a long time. This is an illustration from René Wacquelier's book, Mind to Mind. Is that right? Mind to Mind. And he was writing in the 30s, 40s roughly. Did some pretty solid experiments. Thought he was dealing with telepathy, but I think you could make a good case that it was actually remote viewing he was dealing with. And he encountered this noise pattern. You know, there's supposed to be a laser pointer here, but I don't see one. Does somebody want to have one out there I can borrow? If you can find one, bring it on up and I'll talk more. If you look at the top picture, you see it's kind of a woodblock print of a rising sun with these butterflies superimposed over it. That was the target. The response is interesting. That's what the sketch is down here in the bottom. You see somebody on a horse. Ooh, all right. Somebody's got one. I see it shining. Oh, yes, I have two of them now. Oh, Dick, can I have that? I want to be able to go like that. Which, the yellow button? Okay, good. You know, let's have a duel. Okay, you see the rising sun, the butterflies. Down here, you see this guy on a horse, these troops aligned for battle. And what do we see right here? A rising sun coming over the horizon. Note that? We have something here suspended in the air. That's really quite bizarre. Well, this is the Croix de Guerre, or however you French speakers say that. It's, of course, a French war medal. The person who did this said it is the target is a picture of Napoleon at Austerlitz, and this Croix de Guerre symbolizes the heroism or whatever that took place there. Well, you can see where this came from. You can see the accuracy and the inaccuracies that resulted from this. The rising sun is obvious. In fact, it's strikingly like the other one, although the rays obviously are a little bit thinner. The shapes of the butterfly wings and the shapes in the Croix de Guerre are very interesting, quite similar. And the position of the metal is also superimposed over the sun. It's just that the viewer, we'll call them a viewer for the sake of this discussion, they didn't call them that in the experiment, the viewer received a certain amount of information and then turned it into this. Well, what does Carlier say about it? He says, the impression of the latent image, the target, in other words, actually it's the impression of the target in the viewer's, what we would call subconscious perhaps now. The impression of the latent image excites the imagination and the memories of the percipient. The imagination and the memories of the person doing the perceiving. These are confused, and an interpretation results that frequently is, in an understatement, highly original. Now, how many of you viewers and budding viewers out there have produced highly original results? Yes, it's a common malady, yes. Okay, good. What else can we see here? He showed us some other things, and these will be interesting later on. He noticed some other phenomenon that people had. The previous one showed an overlay that came from imagination and from memory that got confused with the signal elements, right? In this case, the target was really quite accurately reproduced. But as he says here, the target was a drawing of a pair of eyeglasses. The image was received quite clearly, and the percipient was, I don't know what this is, about maybe, to draw an outline of the form and to describe it in detail. Yet he could not recognize what it was. Fairly close representation of the target, even to the little squiggle here, although he had an extra one, had no clue what it was he was drawing. Keep that in mind. Down here, in an experiment Upton Sinclair did in mental radio, that's a book, by the way, that Russell Targ has brought back out again, and it is sold out here, but order it. It's a great book. The target was this flag. The impression the person got was kind of a fragmented pattern. He had most of the elements there, but they were not associated in the same way that the actual target was. These are all interesting and perhaps significant in the long run. When SRI was doing their research early in the early 70s into remote viewing, they suspected, I mean, that was right when the split brain research was starting to come out. Roger Sperry and a guy named Ornstein, particularly who they consulted, they discovered that a lot of the phenomenon that was resulting from remote viewing mimicked kinds of things that they were finding in split brain research, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. That's, by the way, where the idea of the right brain and the left brain come from. That's not a new concept to most of you. The idea, of course, is that the right brain is kind of a global pattern recognition, has a global pattern recognition function, while the left brain is linear and more oriented towards language. Okay? That's a very kind of simple way of describing it, but that's good enough for what we need at the moment. In remote viewing, because of the results we get in the way the behaviors emerge, we come to the conclusion, just like SRI came to the conclusion, and we continue to see these things and come to the same conclusion, that right brain is very important in the process, and that's where we're probably getting a lot of this information. But as in our normal functioning, the left brain is important as well. Now, I'm going to talk a little more about that here in a second, too. I don't know which second, but we'll find out. Yes, I want to talk about the standard model here. Now, when I say standard, I'm not talking about anything that's accepted by academia in this. This is the model that those of us who learned CRV learned from Ingo Swann and Hal Puthoff's method, controlled remote viewing, called way back then coordinate remote viewing. And I think having read many of the reports that came out of that era, I think it pretty well echoes what they learned, or the construct and the model they developed from what they learned from remote viewing experiments. You start off assuming that the human consciousness is kind of divided up. It could be more complicated than this, but this is close enough for government work as it was at the time. You've got the conscious awareness, you've got the subconscious, you've got the limen, which is the threshold between the two. You've got sensory input coming in and extrasensory input coming in. Okay, note where sensory input comes in. That's something we're not usually aware of. The fact is that every piece of sensory information we get comes in below our level of consciousness, and some mechanism in our minds and our brains decides what amount of that sensory information will be filtered into our conscious awareness. I don't remember the exact numbers here. I've heard them several times. But something like maybe 1% or even less than that of all of the sensory data we receive ever makes it into consciousness. If you think about it, we have millions of photoreceptors in our eyes, in our retinas. We have, probably millions of nerve endings in our skin. We have millions of olfactory cell. What do they call those things? Smell cells, whatever. You know, we've got all of these detectors. Each one of them gives a discrete signal. Each one of those signals enters into the process. All of those terminate in our brains. Can you imagine if all of that stuff ended up in our conscious awareness, what we would be like? We'd all be like Russell Targ. Oh, no, I didn't mean that, Russell, sorry. We would, you know, we couldn't function, right? It would be like everything was switched on all the time. You know, that's what nerve agent does to you. So there's got to be some kind of some kind of filter, some way of disconnecting the sensory, all of that sensory load coming in from our conscious mind so that we can still function. And that something along around the lemon does that. It filters and lets in only the important stuff, and we're aware of only things that are directly important to us at that moment, at that time. We can selectively change that by what we attend to, what we choose to give our attention to. Holy cow, I'm using up too much time, aren't I? Well, we can choose to change that, but we don't change very much the amount of that information that comes through. Okay. Now, the presumption is, let me go back. When Ingo Swann first started training us in CRV, he said, I don't teach you to be psychic. I don't even like the word psychic. All I teach you is perception, how to perceive in a way that perhaps you haven't tried to perceive before. I train perception, I don't train remote viewing. So we're teaching the perceptual system how to work, how to get this discrete information. Now, if all of the sensory input comes at the subconscious, it makes sense that the so-called extrasensory input would come in there as well, and that seems to be how the system does indeed work. So all this stuff is coming into the subconscious. The idea of remote viewing, writ large, is to try and figure out how to get the extrasensory stuff into conscious awareness as readily as you get your sensory stuff. So far, we haven't been successful at doing it as readily, but we can improve our capabilities with practice and learning good principles. Okay? There's more, however, that complicates the picture where we'll get to. But first, I want to talk about a proposed new model, in a way, a brain hemisphere model. Further psychological research over the years has shown, in fact, that this notion of subconscious is a little bit fuzzy. What exactly is a subconscious? Is there really a subconscious? Is it just a matter of what you're paying attention to and what you're not? There's still a lot of debate about that. But there is some interesting indication that rather than a subconscious, it's really kind of the right brain where the data comes in, where all that sensory data comes in. Remember, the right brain isn't lingual, doesn't have language, although there are some interesting exceptions to that. The data comes in there, so we might say, this in a sense is the subconscious, and I'm being very simplistic, you psychologists, don't attack. In a sense, this is the subconscious, and in a sense, this is the conscious part, the consciously aware part, the left brain. So what happens is then the data is selectively passed from the right brain to the left brain, and then the left brain has to decide what to do with it. See what my next slide is here. I'll come back to that in a second. If you think about your everyday life and what happens in it, you're always having to make decisions, you're always having to interpret things that happen. You know, people who like to watch soap opera, of course, they get a lot of that because all these people are saying things and doing things and interacting and stuff. And you see all the people having to sort out what those little interesting little social nuances actually mean, right? You're interpreting what's happening in a social situation. Same thing happens in just every other aspect of everyday life. We have to interpret this data that comes in. We have to interpret what it means. Is it a threat? Is it an opportunity? Does it imply pleasure? Does it imply pain? Does it mean obligation? Do we have to respond to it? Can we ignore it? All those kinds of things are being decided on the fly, split-second fashion in our minds and in our brains. And it's the left brain that makes those interpretations, as I'll explain here in a minute. Okay? Now, I've laid that background. I'm going to talk about some interesting phenomena here that show a little bit how these things work. And this is going to be a bit scattered. I'm warning you up front. A bit scattered, maybe a little inconclusive, but there are some interesting things that maybe we can lay as a foundation to move on. Okay, the first of these areas of interest are what is classically known as subliminal perception. Thank goodness they've changed it because I very seldom can say that word subliminal. I guess George Bush has a problem with it too. One suggested alternative is preconscious processing. Another one is perception without awareness. There are other people who actually, there's some skepticism that it even exists in psychological circles. I think the evidence is pretty good, in my opinion. I'm going to choose preconscious processing except when I forget and choose a different term. Okay? The notion here is that if a person receives a stimulus, some kind of sensory stimulus, too briefly or too subtly for it to register in the conscious mind, remember again, all of the sensory stuff's dumping into the subconscious, the right brain, or whatever you want to call it. All that stuff is getting in there. It's being interpreted. Okay? If your conscious mind isn't aware of it, there still appears to be an interpretation process going on in the subconscious. Your subconscious mind apparently can indeed think. That's quite interesting. People tend to assume that what they're consciously aware of is all there is that's worth paying attention to. There seems to be more to it than all that. And how they test this? Well, they might flash something on a screen so quickly that it happens quicker than our conscious recognition process can work, but our subconscious picks it up. Or they might embed a stimulus in some distracting pattern or something that our conscious mind doesn't pick out. It's just random dots, but our subconscious can pick up. And I'm sure all of you are craving popcorn now because I've just flashed a popcorn icon. No, not really. Just kidding. Okay. Well, here's an experiment that shows some interesting things. They showed this particular picture. As you can see, it's kind of a industrial scene in the 19th century. Horse, wagon loaded with stuff, bales of what could be cotton, I don't know, it's hard to say. Kind of a loading dock, buildings here. Somewhere in this picture there's some people, but I didn't scan it clearly enough to... Oh, there's a person right there. Okay. That was almost subliminal, wasn't it? Okay. It looks better on the screen here. Okay. They flashed that at varying lengths of time to different subjects. I don't think it was the same subject. I'd have to reread it, but... And you see 4 different responses at different times of exposure. First one here, they got this vaguely dog-like animal here, and some kind of building and some appurtenances here, but they really, oh, there's a harness on it. I guess they figured out it was either a horse or an ox, whatever. Now, I don't know which order this goes in, but you do tend to see the detail grow. This was the most detailed one. Now, the scene that was shown was quite busy, but after enough exposure, they tended to get some pretty good detail from it, although none of it is really exact. They've added things that weren't there, they left out things that were there, and they've oriented things differently than they were. I'll go back to this scene here. You can see there's some similarities and some differences from what they have. In this scene, whoops, too far, the wrong way. We're about to be confused. I told you PowerPoint was my downfall. No, okay. Yeah, I don't think that there's any people over here by this, whoops, wrong thing, by this animal here, and yet in this picture they've added a person. Okay, so there's something going on. Okay, that's one example. Here's another example of an experiment. They flashed this to the subject very quickly, and then asked the person to identify what it was. They came up with this sketch here, and they thought it was a dome with a window in it. Well, you can see the shape is quite similar to at least one of these geological forms. But then that night, the person had a dream. And in the morning, they drew their impression of the dream. And you see they've got this raised up area. You've got these 3 people. These people they interpreted as their friends. But you see what's in this picture. It doesn't show up very well, but there's some people here. There's a person there. You've got these 3 spires separated by remove. You can see where some of the data came through. You can see where some of it's accurate, but there's some interpretation going on. Okay, what's the next one? We'll come to that in a second. Anybody here have a remote viewing session whose results look like this? Well, we have some. Okay. Interesting. Interesting, don't you think? What does it mean? Well, we'll find out. Maybe or maybe not. Another psychological phenomenon is a thing called visual agnosia, where we have definition here. The inability to visually recognize familiar objects. The object can be seen but are not understood. Somebody might see that chair and not know it's a chair. They see it, they can walk around it, they can even pick it up, but just looking at it, they wouldn't know it was a chair. The interesting thing is, by feeling it or smelling it or tasting it, assuming it's something other than a chair, they actually can identify the object, but not by seeing it. By seeing it, they can't identify it. So here's a little quote from one of the books on the subject. Subjects are able to describe parts of an object or may be able to copy a picture of it, but they have no idea what the object is or how it might be used. Here's some examples. This was one that's repeated a lot. It was actually used in the 1975 report to the CIA that SRI turned in on their remote viewing program. The responses of what the subject did was draw the target photo. See, these are the target photos. They reproduced the target photos, and then were asked what it was they drew. The top left one, subject said, I don't know. I still don't know what it is. The top right one, they said, well, it could be a dog or some other animal. Now, well, whatever. Bottom left, it could be a beach stump. And over here, it says it's a wagon or a car of some kind, but the larger vehicle is being pulled by the smaller one. What on earth are they talking about? They interpreted that as another vehicle. Okay? Now, visual agnosia is caused by lesions in certain parts of the brain, some kind of injury or whatever, incapacity, that seems to cut off the visual centers from the centers that, I guess, do the interpreting, the language centers, the interpretive portions. In a way, and I know this is really stretching, but in a way, it's kind of separates right brain from left brain functions in a sort of way. That may or may not become important here in a moment. Here's another example. This is a picture of an owl. This is the response that the viewer, that the patient provided. And this is what was said. When copying this picture, the subject stated that all he saw was a complex pattern of lines which did not correspond to a particular object. Now we can look at that and we know what that is for the most part, except for you who have been rurally deprived and never seen an owl before. But you'll note that there's a bit of an incompleteness here, up here with this eye. And you see the viewer actually here we go again. The subject actually kind of captured that, didn't know why it was there. The text of the book points out that normal subjects who don't have these problems would have seen this picture and likely would have completed the incomplete part there as they were capturing things, because they knew it was an owl and their interpretive function would take over and fix whatever defects there might have been in the drawing. This leads us to a thing called the left brain interpreter. This is proposed by a psychologist quite well known by the name of Gazzaniga. I think it's Michael Gazzaniga, if I'm not mistaken. He suggests, and I'll read this, we humans have a specialized system to carry out this interpretive synthesis, and it is located in the brain's left hemisphere. I've called it the interpreter, a system that seeks explanation for both internal and external events in order to produce appropriate behaviors in response. In other words, there is something up here in our brains and minds, it's hard to separate those two, which interprets everything that comes in. Now, remember what I said about that before. There's something that interprets the data comes in. This is a candidate for that, and Gazzaniga, I think, really believes that that probably is what I was talking about before. Okay. Now, just a brief talk about right brain, left brain. I talked about split brain research. We're talking seriously about split brain. There's a large bundle of fibers that connect the two hemispheres of the brain. And some people with epilepsy and other conditions like that seem sometimes cutting that bundle of fibers helps them. What this does is allow cross-communication between the two hemispheres. So probably that's where the sensory data comes across to a great extent. In some people, they cut that. You leave a discrete left and right hemisphere, although there's still the primitive parts of the brain are usually intact and still have some cross-connection. And that does cause some interesting and profound dysfunctions in people in certain behaviors in their normal lives. One experiment that shows this, they showed, these over here were not shown to the people, but this is just to illustrate, give you an idea of what we're talking about here. They took half of each of these figures, represented over here on the right. Okay? They flashed those on a screen to subjects who were suffering from some kind of split brain effector, but they only showed it to each independent visual field. The left visual field is connected to the right hemisphere. The right visual field is connected to the left hemisphere. And I'm not going to go into it in more detail than that because it can get fairly complicated. There's a little cross-pollination between the two, but that's good enough for now. Okay? So they showed this half picture to each side. And these were the results. Now you have to remember, again, this is almost pre-conscious process. This is almost a subliminal experiment because they don't show these for long periods of time. They just flash them. They wanted to see what kind of perception these people would get and what kind of results they would draw once these subjects have been flashed to the separate hemispheres independently. This was the right hemisphere response to that brief stimulus. If you'll note, things still seem to be divided down the middle. It's a fairly trustworthy representation given the short exposure of what had been shown. Notice, though, to the left hemisphere, we're talking, the left hemisphere. You see where you got half a roof here, which you would have gotten because there's only half a roof here. You get half a roof here. Here, the person tried to complete the roof and add some doors and windows. Okay? Here, instead of half a circle of the figure, of the stick figure, they put a whole circle in and kind of put appendages on both sides. Same thing up here. Well, what's going on? It appears that the left hemisphere feels a need for closure. Now, how many people have spouses like that? Okay. The left hemisphere has a need for closure, so it adds things that aren't really there. It interprets things. Does that sound like anything that happens in remote viewing? Keep thinking about that. Here's another split brain experiment. They took two scenes, and I've redone these. A snow scene that was shown to the right hemisphere. They show it to the left visual field connected with the right hemisphere. They showed a chicken claw to the right visual field, which connects to the left hemisphere. Don't get confused. Chicken claw, left hemisphere, snow scene, right hemisphere. Then they showed the subject a whole menu of objects and things that they could select to correspond with the things that their hemispheres had chosen. Okay? And again, there was a division there, so that each hemisphere saw a different, body of things, a different selection. The left hand of the subject picked the shovel, picked a snow shovel. Okay? Makes sense. Snow scene, right? The right hand connected to the left hemisphere. So in other words, the left hemisphere picked the chicken. Makes sense. Chicken claw goes with chicken. Any problem so far? No. The problem that arose was when they asked the person why they made the choices they did. Remember, right brain does not verbalize, does not have language connection except in certain conditions. Left brain does. That's the one that does the explaining. This is what they said. Asked why the choice of the shovel and the chicken, the subject responded, "Oh, that's simple. The chicken claw goes with the chicken, and you need a shovel to clean out the chicken coop." Okay? The left brain noticed the left hand's choice, as I write here, and interpreted the choice in terms of what the left brain knew. It did not have access to what the right brain knew. Okay? So the left brain did the interpretation and did the verbalizing. Okay? Since all the left brain knew about was the chicken, it had to figure out what the heck that shovel was there for, and it concluded it was to clean out the chicken shed. Some people might say that a little differently, but that's how I'm going to say it. Okay, here's another example, a split brain example. Think about this in terms of what we talked about with Rohr-Collier. This is drawn by the left hand, in other words, the right hemisphere, the left hand of a subject after they were shown a picture of a bicycle. The subject said he didn't see anything. Okay, he's drawing it. It's being shown to his right hemisphere. His left hemisphere doesn't see it. Left hemisphere is verbal. Left hemisphere says, "I don't see it." It's not lying, it's just stupid. Sorry. Oh, no. Okay. The left hemisphere says, "I don't see anything." And yet with the left hand, that subject was able to draw this fairly passable representation of a bicycle. The interesting thing about this is I've seen remote viewing drawings in remote viewing sessions that were about equivalent to this as far as the target that they were doing. Okay? Interesting. Now, this is an interesting one too. Note this. The subject drew this sketch, said that this is sand over here, sand here. There's something here with rails on it. It's floating in the water. And there's this hoop thing. I don't know what that hoop thing is. This is, they thought was sun and clouds or whatever. That's interesting, huh? This was not a split brain test. This was a remote viewing session. This was the target, bridge in, I think, Cologne, Germany. And you can see the strong resemblance between the remote viewing session result and the bridge. But the viewer did not know this was a bridge. All they knew that there was water involved. They interpreted this as floating on the water. They didn't quite know what that was. But they missed the whole idea of bridge. And there's some obviously left-brain interpretation going on here. Okay, I'm going to show you some other examples. This is one that I did. It's kind of fun, but I'm feeling a little embarrassed about it. Some of the input. I got an idea of serried ranks. How many of these serried ranks are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Interesting, okay? Then I tried to turn it into Stonehenge. A will break, Easter Island, Stonehenge. I was still confused. I thought, maybe this is a castle. There's something rounded, and there's something sticking out of it, and it's got a lip on it. Okay, it's a castle. Then I drew these patterns. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I drew these lines. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I get my feedback. I go, oh man, 1, 2, 3, 4, whoops, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I don't know if I was picking up 6 or not, but it sure came through a lot. But you can see what's happening here. My subconscious perceived this circular, elliptic kind of notion with something mounting over out of it, and I turned it into the top of a castle. Interestingly, I didn't include anything down below that. That's all the sketch I did. I just knew there was something coming up, and because my left brain didn't know enough about it, it jumped to a conclusion and said, it's the top of a castle. Now, the patterns here actually are pretty close to a number of the patterns in here. And the point I want to make here is that oftentimes you can trust your sketching when you can't trust your words. And I think the reason is, when we're sketching, quite frequently, in a way, our subconscious is talking to our hand. It bypasses analysis to a great extent. I've seen many, many, many student remote viewings where they have drawn a very remarkable sketch that closely resembles an aspect of the target. And then they go and label it as something completely different. Their left brain looks at it and says, I don't know what the heck this is, let's make something up. And then proceeds to make up all kinds of elaborate things. If they kept their pen off and didn't write any words, people might have judged it a hit. They look at it, and their left brain says, oh, I like these verbal descriptions, and they don't believe it. So oftentimes the sketching turns out to be right. Okay. Another example. This was a fun one. I got this kind of sketch, and I got an AOL of clown face. Then I got this little AOL, looks like poached eggs in a pan, something like that. I got this sketch, and I got this notion of an arm hanging down holding something. Now, if you're going to look at that, what do you think that is? If you looked at that, what would you call that? Say again? Fire hydrant. What else? Okay. Scuba diver, diving helmet. Okay. Well, guess what? I'm just like the rest of you. AOL break, scuba diver. AOL break, porky pig. I don't know where they came from, but I guess you can kind of think that might look like it. Well, what the heck was this thing? This is kind of fun. Check this out. That was the photo. Now I got active. That was data. AOL break, shouting. They were probably yelping, but I interpreted it as shouting. Quizzical, engrossed, observing, onlookers and looked upon. Okay, that's data. Bodies shaking, wiggling, like there are a number of people intermixed with each other, but of differing categories. I got an AOL break of dark skin and light skin folks intermingled. Okay? But there is some interesting stuff here. If you look at the sketch, when I drew this sketch, I was trying to do roughly what we call a tracker, where you just let your hand go and you don't try and draw anything, you just feel where it should go. And actually the sketch is more accurate than it seems. Because look at this. First of all, you see the pan here, right? Got the pan here, got the pan here. We have a head, we have ears, we have a body, and we have a tail. Do you believe me? I don't know if it is or not, but it looks good, don't you think? Okay. But, I think you could. The thing you always got to worry about, and I haven't heard anybody mention this here, the cautions that you have to have in remote viewing, one of those is data fitting. Trying to make the real data fit what you did so that you feel better about yourself. Okay? There's a quick question. Yes? Did I have 3 little dogs? There is one here with his head, his ears, his body, and his tail. 3 dogs. I have 3 things here. That's also a possibility, but that could be data fitting. You got to watch that, okay? I don't know. It's just an interesting speculation. Okay, another quick question. Better be quick or I won't answer it.
This relates to maybe the sensations you're getting are from part of the form, but not all the form. Like that muffin pan, it seems like you're getting sensations inside
Exactly.
the pan where the muffins fit in. That's why you're doing these vertical.
Could be.
And you weren't feeling the touch.
And that ties in with some of the psychology stuff we've been talking about. You get bits and pieces of the data, then your brain interprets it. The left brain interprets it. All right, one more question, quick.
Do you get much flipping left to right when you do your
Left-right reversals, those happen a lot. And you get that in also subliminal perception. You get that in left brain, right brain issues. You get that in visual agnosia as well. Interesting correlation with remote viewing data. I do sometimes, and sometimes I don't. Pat Price has a famous session where he has a really significant left-right reversal in it. But you'll note this. I have never got a hand in a session before. This is the only time I ever did it, but look how closely that resembles that. But here's another interpretation. It doesn't show up very well, but you'll notice this guy's boot goes like that. And see, this is pretty close to the same thing, and I interpret it as somebody holding something. Okay? Okay, so we've talked a bit about I've talked a little bit about incoming data. We've talked a little bit about AOL. I kind of mixed things up in this presentation a little bit. It's kind of confusing, perhaps. I just want to show you some interesting ideas and provoke some thoughts about what could be going on cognitively when we end up with mental noise in our sessions. So let's go from here and then talk about, we acknowledge that AOL exists, analytic overlay exists. What can we do about it? Anybody have any thoughts? What can you do about AOL? John? With AOL, you can take a break. Other ideas? Okay, he suggests, how about focus on the sketching and drawing skills and try and avoid the verbalization? That's what you mean, right? I don't want to take liberties with your wording. Any other thoughts? Yes? Right, don't worry about how the drawing looks. Pay attention to what's going on inside your mind. Betty Edwards' her book, Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain, is a mandatory book for people to read and use during remote viewing. Russell has a comment, and then I'm going to have to move on. Yes? Excellent. I'd forgotten to bring that up in my slide. I'm glad he mentioned that. Russell says, you emphasize the surprising elements, the things that come out that are unexpected. If it's something that fits in with your storyline, there's a very good chance it's wrong. But if it's something that just leaps out at you that you hadn't expected, there's a very good chance that that's signal. Okay. The things that surprise you are probably true. Now, your interpretation of them could be off. So the idea is to try and report it exactly as you experienced it, not how your brain. We'll talk later. Yeah, that's the idea. First impressions, if you think about it a while, you may actually be contaminating the information you get. What can we do about AOL? Well, we've got this little laundry list here. I got to find that neat effect where these things spool across as you push the button. I didn't know you could do that with PowerPoint. Oh, well, you live and learn, right? Okay, the first thing is kind of the mantra of remote viewing: describe, don't name. And this comes out as early as 1972-73 in the SRI literature. They discovered that when viewers try to name, you're actually coming to an analytical conclusion. What is this thing? Your left brain gives you an answer. It's a castle. Well, it's not a castle. You named it. If you just described the darn thing, a lipped object with something poking out over the top. If I'd have said that, I'd have been right. If I said it was a castle, I'd have been wrong. Now, in that instance, of course, I drew the castle. There was AOL getting into my sketch. That was one of those cases where the sketch wasn't quite as accurate as it should have been. Okay. Describe, don't name. Learn to recognize noise. And I'm going to talk in my next slide about how you do that to some extent. Objectify the noise. When you figure out what the noise is, get it out. Dealing with AOL is kind of a Zen-like process. You don't try to quiet your mind so much as to allow what comes in to flow out again. And as you let it flow out, it kind of cleanses the signal, so to speak. I don't want to get too mystical here, but it kind of cleanses the signal. You get it out, you get it on paper, you objectify it. You identify it as noise, you write it down and say, this is noise, I'm done with it. If you don't do that, it will hang around up here and go round and round with all your other data, and you'll build this big story that it has little bits of truth, but is mostly baloney. And I know most of you look like you don't like baloney very well. Oh, maybe you do. Okay. Okay, break. That was mentioned. You want to take a break. When Ingo taught us, you identify an AOL, you say AOL break. Break is important because what you're doing is sending your subconscious a message. You're saying, stop right there. You don't want to follow down that path. It leads to nowhere. You're telling yourself to break off from that and return back to where you know the data was accurate, or at least you feel it was accurate. Okay? So breaking off of there is important, and telling yourself to do that is an important aspect of it. Doubt. If you start getting confident about your data, feel like you're on, feel like you're doing well, all right, this is dynamite, this is going to be such a huge success, you are going to be so embarrassed. You're going to look like half of us did yesterday when we saw what the actual result was on those tables out there. Okay? Doubt what you get. You know, I don't know how exactly to explain that, but don't trust yourself. Now, that's not a very good way of saying it either, because you do need to trust yourself. But don't take yourself too seriously. Maybe that's it. Okay? Maybe somebody else can explain it better than me. Anyway, keep your left brain busy. Okay? Left brain wants to be helpful. Its job in normal life is to interpret events. Its job is to tell you what's going on. And it does that job very well normally, under normal circumstances. When you're remote viewing, it is not normal circumstances, and then it gets in the way. So if you give it something to do, make it happy, it's going to contribute less to the process and leave your right brain busy doing what it's supposed to do. How do you keep your left brain busy? One of those has to do, that's one of the reasons for the structure in controlled remote viewing. You know, a lot of people think, oh, it's way complex. There's too much going on. There's all these things you're supposed to do. I don't want to have anything to do with that. That doesn't have anything to do with being psychic, so to speak. It serves a number of purposes, actually. One of those is to help organize your impressions that come in. But it also serves to keep your left brain busy. If your left brain is sorting out all that structure, then your left brain tends to be left alone. Your right brain tends to be left alone to do its job. Okay? So structure actually serves a number of benefits, but that's one of them that keeps your left brain busy. There are other ways to do that too, but foremost of all, sketch. Now, there's a lot of you out there who are very verbally oriented folks. Most of you are not women, contrary to myth, but many of you are. But there's a lot of verbal guys too. And the tendency is to verbalize every impression you get. Remember, the verbal processing come out of the left brain. And so if you encourage that, you may get yourself in trouble. Sketching is much more right brain oriented. There is a place for verbalization, but if you get carried away with it, it'll get you in trouble. Now let's talk about how you recognize noise. There are a couple of non-intuitive things here. We talk about remote viewing, we think it has all to do with vision, that it all has to do with seeing the target, that it all has to do with mental imagery and visualization. Well, it does to some degree. But you got to remember that we have 5 physical senses that we're used to dealing with. That means vision is 20% of those. You have other 80% of your perception, or at least of your senses, are involved in other things. Now I'm being a little misleading there, because actually, although vision is 1/5 of the senses, it actually occupies almost 50% of the brain. So vision is still important, and it occupies a very important part in remote viewing. But the other senses are important as well. So sometimes they can get you out of trouble that your visualization, internal visualizing processes will get you into. Okay, but let's talk about the recognizing internal overlay, or analytical overlay. And this will not be new to many of you, but it doesn't hurt to review. First thing is counterintuitive. People who don't know anything about remote viewing think, I get this really bright picture in my mind, and that's got to be the target. Ironically, that's usually not the target. If you get a clear, bright, sharp, static image in your mind, 90 to 95% of the time, it's got nothing to do with the target. That's something your left brain is supplying to account for the information it's getting from your right brain. Okay? So that's one indicator. If it's a very clear, obvious picture, you're probably wrong. There are rare occasions when you're not, but you probably are. If you have a comparator word, what's a comparator word? Like. Man, you guys should have been quicker on that one. Like, as if, sort of. Okay, here's something I always tell my students. I say, when you say one thing is like something else, What's the one thing you can absolutely be sure about that first thing? It's not it. Why not? That's exactly right. If you're comparing two things, that means there are two things, and one is not the other. Now, again, like anything else, that's not universal. In many cases, that's true. The target, let's say, is a lighthouse. You say, this thing reminds me of, or it's like a chimney. There's a lot of correlations between the two, but obviously one is not the other, and you are comparing two things there. Sometimes you will say the target will be a lighthouse, and you will say this is like a lighthouse. You will be accidentally right in that case, okay? You're comparing it to itself in some way, and you maybe got enough data. We'll talk about AOL matching here in a second. Finally, well, not finally, hesitation, particularly in parts of the process where you need to go bang, bang, bang to keep analysis from creeping in. If you stop, you say, all right, let's see, it's tall, wide, hard. Let's see. Oh, I know, it's a structure. What are you doing? That's right. You're trying to figure it out. You're analyzing what it might be. You're analyzing the data, okay? Hesitation can get you in trouble. Actually having a rhythmic process through, for the most part, again, not a universal rule, but a rhythmic process through, keeping up a certain rhythm, can actually benefit you staying on track. Finally, inflection. Let's see. Okay, it's wide, rounded, hard, solid. Lighthouse? What are you doing? You're guessing. Guessing will almost always be wrong. And even if you're not guessing, you're doing something even worse. You're trying to elicit information from the monitor. You all have seen, TV psychics get up there and they say, oh, let's see, you have a sister, you have a dog. They put a question mark on the ends of things, and they're waiting for the person to respond. Now, I'm not saying they do it even on purpose, but there's a human tendency to want to elicit information so that you don't have to be psychic, okay? So they'll add this question mark, and even if a person, it's our normal pattern to want to respond to people. When people ask a question or a favor, we want to respond to them. That's normal. That's ingrained in us. So when somebody poses the thing as a question, even if it's just through inflection, our tendency is, we might not say yes or no, but we might imperceptibly nod or shake our heads or something like that. And that all conveys information. So if you get a question mark at the end of an input, you're either guessing or you're trying to elicit information, and both of those will get you in trouble in remote viewing. Okay. Finally, and I'll wrap this up because we're way late, I'm sorry to say. When an AOL is almost like the target, we call it AOL matching. Let me give you an example. Let me come back. Oftentimes you'll get viewers who come up with sessions that look strikingly like the actual target photo or strikingly like the target, and they're very impressed and they're very pleased, and they think, look, I described the target exactly. Well, that's not necessarily true. It may be that they have an image of a target, a fairly well-known target or something like that target in their minds, and when the data comes in, it sparks that memory, and their memory is what they're reporting, not the actual data from the target. That's not necessarily bad. That may convey all the information you need. But let me show you an example of this. This is another one I did. I started off with this sketch, and I called an AOL of geodesic dome. Then I got this small, kind of like an ideogram-like sketch with a kind of a rounded shape in these uprights. Then you can see this sketch kind of morph. Okay? It kind of forms as I go. As I'm trying to capture this feeling and this impression I have, I move down and try different things out. And this is my final result. I got the sketch like this, and although that's unfortunately a bad picture, it was the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. Some of you have actually seen this session. I've shown it before. You, of course, get the minarets, you get the dome, you see these lines here, you get these lines here, kind of a square pedestal sort of a thing is resting on the same thing here, or up here, like that. You see, this is quite remarkably like the target as far as a remote viewing session goes. I can't say that I didn't have a really strong remote viewing image of this thing, but I think it's probably more likely that I had the memory of a mosque like this, and I took some of the data and incorporated it into the memory, and then that's what I reported on the paper. I would call this AOL matching. There's analysis involved because I'm interpreting the actual target, but it's informed by a whole bunch of actual data, okay, that makes it more accurate and more real seeming. Okay, So what's the bottom line in trying to avoid remote viewing? Remember, describe, don't name. Now, that's the end of my session.